I've taught on the subject for about 20 years, and I think it was very well embraced. And I think that we were making really good progress, and really had a lot of folks who were embracing the training, embracing the mission, the how we were hoping this would move us forward. I think in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a shift where the training went from being about inclusion and about diversity. The perception was that some of the training got a little hostile. There was a lot of probably polarization in some of the language.
I think it's unfortunate that some of the language kind of embedded in how DEI trainings have been rolled out have left participants feeling defensive or shamed. And I think whenever we're asking someone to learn something or change something or see a new perspective about the world or the society or themselves, it's almost impossible to do that when you're leading with shame or blame.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Federnick, and today, my two guests and I will be talking about a term that commonly appeared in many school mission statements several years ago. But today, the term is highly controversial, and it's emblematic of the nation's political divides. And today, it's far less likely to appear in school mission statements, according to the Pew Research Center. The term diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI. Well, today we're going to be talking about the backlash that emerged over a set of ideas that on the surface seem so consistent with democratic ideals. What could be controversial about celebrating America's diversity, or the diversity of the students in a school or a classroom or a community? What could be controversial about the idea that all students feel included and are given an equitable shot at success? Is the pushback against DEI simply a reaction by racists or anti-LGBTQ folks railing against multiculturalism? Or is it something else? Let me introduce you to my two guests who will be weighing in on those questions and whether there is a version of DEI that could be embraced across political lines. First, I'd like to welcome Dennis DiMaggio. Welcome, Dennis. Tell our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, and where you live.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I appreciate it. My name is Dennis DiMaggio. I live just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I am a learning and development professional. I started my career actually in healthcare, spent the first 10 years working in nursing homes, assisted living, home health, and then made a change in career over into the learning and development profession. Most of my time is spent in training or change management, organizational development, or coaching. This particular topic is one that's interested me. I have been teaching on diversity and inclusion for well over 20 years now. I've also volunteered with Braver Angels, which is a political organization or an apolitical organization that seeks to have conversations between people of conservative and liberal persuasions. And I'm on the board of the Pro-Human Foundation, which I believe, Ken, is how we were connected.
That's right. I've gotten connected with a bunch of terrific people at the Pro-Human Foundation, and I appreciate the fact that they suggested that you and I connect. And I had read a little bit about some things that you've written on this subject, which made it really a perfect fit for this conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Dennis. My other guest is Channa Pitt. It's great to have you. I'd like you to share a little bit about yourself and in your background as an educator.
Sure. So I started off my career as a high school English teacher in LA Unified School District, where I was also a literacy coach at the secondary level. So spent a lot of time working directly with English teachers and teachers in the humanities. I then was also a charter school principal in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina. Very interesting period of time there, and really got to test my chops and all my education in that space. Learned a lot considerably. And then I was also a researcher for the Learning Policy Institute after getting my doctorate at Stanford University. in education with a specialty in race, inequality, and language in education. And since then, I've moved to Sacramento, and I am here as we speak, and Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services here at the Sacramento County Office of Education.
And Channa, you were in the Folsom Cordova school district for a while, and you focused on social emotional learning. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's the one thing I skipped in my bio overview. Yeah, so prior to coming to Sacramento County Office of Ed, I was at the Folsom Cordova School District. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to jump into this subject. It's sort of vexing to me, but it's fascinating. And as I said earlier, sort of emblematic of the political divide. Dennis, I want to ask you first, what do you think caused DEI to go off the rail? Why do you suppose so many school districts in the last couple of years have removed it from their mission statements?
Yeah. So I will say that all of my experiences in the business world, not in schools, but obviously we've seen something similar happen in businesses all over the place. Especially very recently, companies like Ford and Harley Davidson and John Deere have backed away from a lot of their DE&I training and some of the commitments that they've made. So I'm sure that there is a core, a parallel in the schools, but I'll talk a little bit more, if that's okay, about kind of where it backed away in the business world. I think that this is a subject that was pretty prevalent. I know that, as I said earlier, I've taught on this subject for about 20 years, and I think it was very well embraced, and I think that we were making really good progress, and really had a lot of folks who were embracing the training, embracing the mission, the how we were hoping this would move us forward. And you asked kind of how it kind of went off the rails a little bit. I think in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a shift where the training went from being about inclusion and about diversity, and I think the perception was that some of the training got a little hostile. That there was a lot of probably polarization in some of the language, and I think that initiated a little bit of the pushback, and then I think that it became harder in some places to pull apart the diversity and inclusion from the hardened politics that's just going on. And a friend of mine, the way he phrases it, he says, yeah, everybody kind of puts on their political team jerseys. And that was also reflected around the subject of diversity and inclusion. And so it became harder to separate it from politics. And I think that those things combined, I think, kind of led it off the rails as you described it.
Dennis, say a little bit more about how it's certainly a climate in a sense of polarization, but these terms, diversity, inclusion, equity, seems like the opposite of polarization. It's like pulling us together and saying, we equitable opportunities. We want to celebrate our diversity. We don't, and inclusion is clearly the opposite of polarization. So how do those seemingly innocuous but important terms lead to more polarization in your view?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that it's certainly diversity and inclusion. Those terms, those have been around for a long time, and so those were, I believe, always seen as being good terms. I mean, who doesn't want to have a more inclusive business? Who doesn't want to have a place where everyone feels like they belong and they can plug in and bring themselves to work? And then the idea of diversity, that we want you to be you and we want me to be me. We want everybody to feel comfortable, and no matter who you are as you come to the office. And so I think that those two words were not just innocuous. I think that they were actually very, very welcoming words. And so when I think about why things changed, I have a hard time plugging it onto those words, because I think those haven't changed and they were always very inviting. The word equity, I think, can be, but I think there's just so much misunderstanding around that particular term. It's been around for a lot less time. And I think it just suffers from some overload. And oftentimes when you use that, you're we're using the same language with somebody, but we might not be using the same dictionary. People may have different thoughts in mind about what that means. And so I think that term, I don't think that term is divisive. I think that term just needs more clarity in order for people to really to understand it. But when I talk about terms maybe becoming a little bit more hostile, I mean terms that we began to find in materials. So before 5, 6, 7 years ago, you would not have found in most diversity training terms like white fragility. You would not have heard somebody in a class to tell participants to check your privilege. You would not have heard about cultural appropriation. You wouldn't have heard about toxic masculinity. I think that those particular terms, not that there aren't times when they're probably needed, but I think those particular terms became a lot more divisive, and that's what I meant when I said that the vocabulary changed.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Dennis. Channa, I want to come to you. And what does DEI mean to you? And I'll ask you the same question. Why do you think it's sort of gone off the rail a bit and become so controversial?
I couldn't agree more with Dennis around the connection between topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion and our political climate. I think that has really seeped into the ecosystem of many schools and classrooms and systems kind of across the board. And I think it's hard to parse out the politics and the political rhetoric from the intention and the purpose of efforts around greater diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. I think when it comes to thinking about our public schools, I see a real mixed bag. I think perhaps as a counterpoint to what some businesses and corporations are doing, I think a lot of schools are doubling down and unwavering in their commitment to efforts around DEI and understanding that, the curriculum that better matches the experiences and the language and the assets and cultural dynamics of the students in the classroom is seen as a positive, right? So that every student feels like they belong and they see themselves in the work. And I think another thing I'm seeing is that in some places that there has been this kind of pushback against these efforts, and there are districts that exist in schools in our community that, we don't say those words here. We don't talk about DEI. We talk about character building, or we talk about people feeling a welcoming environment, or they use other language that are getting after some of those same principles. And I think it's unfortunate that some of the language kind of embedded in how DEI trainings have been rolled out have left participants feeling defensive or shamed. And I think whenever a person, we're asking someone to learn something or change something or see a new perspective about the world or the society or themselves, it's almost impossible to do that when you're leading with shame or blame. That immediately, like, our natural instinct is to put a wall up and say, no, that's not me, but I don't believe that, or that's not who I am, and I've never done right. We've all probably heard a lot of those same sentiments or heard of those sentiments that happen in equity trainings. And I think the way that a facilitator or a trainer would teach around concepts of diversity and equity inclusion, it's very sensitive, right? I think we are in a country that has not done a great job kind of across the board in terms of admitting when there were things, the dark parts of our history where we have, taught ourselves, taught our children in schools in ways that kind of sugarcoat a lot of things that really shouldn't be sugar-coated, and should be more blunt and maybe more honest about the reality and the truth of our history. But I think there's ways to do that doesn't suggest that there's any one group that should be to blame for this or should, be doing some sort of apology necessarily. I think it's a way of understanding, and the way that I think about it is DEI and efforts around greater belonging is really about being honest so that students kind of know their history and know that it's a shared history, and in order to move forward and really get after more equal outcomes, we have to understand what's needed, and that different people need different things. And I think that's the piece of the equity part for that particular word that means a lot to me and a lot of educators in our system, is that, we can acknowledge that different people learn differently, and we all need something a little bit different to be successful. And for me, the definition of equity would be a couple things. One, that everyone gets what they need to be successful, without detracting from what anyone else might need to be successful. And I think that's where sometimes it goes wrong. It's this perception of, I'm going to take from you to give to you because your success is more important than this other person's success. And that is not the true definition of equity. I think the other part is this assumption that that equity should be that we should be aiming for equal outcomes. That is really what we're looking for. Is that if this person needs additional supports or resources or time to learn something or to be successful, to feel safe in order to learn, so that we can have more equal outcomes at the other end. And I think right now what we see is that for generations, there is a lot of predictability around someone's race, socioeconomic status, in some instances, gender or gender identity can predict how well a person will perform or their life outcomes beyond school. And I think that's the piece that I'm really interested in disrupting.
So let me pose a question. I alluded to it in my intro, and that is it. I think there's some who have reacted to the pushback against DEI, saying, "Well, it must be racism rearing its ugly head." I mean, how could anyone be opposed to equity and diversity and inclusion unless they simply didn't want it to occur? They're just opposed to sort of this multicultural celebration of our multicultural society, and they don't want that pushed on their kids. It must be coming from a racist place. But Channa, do you think it's coming from that place, or do you think it's something else?
I think it's possible in some instances that it might be coming from that. I don't deny that there are folks in our world who absolutely are racist, kind of period. On the other hand, I think the majority of people in our country do not consider themselves racist, do not fancy themselves supremacist in one way or another. And I think any suggestion to that point for folks is an immediate shutdown of like, it sounds like you might be calling me racist. Absolutely not. That's not who I am. I won't tolerate being talked to like that, or an assumption or allusion to that sort of kind of characterization. I think at the heart of it, though, really is that when it comes to conversations about race and racial equity, in particular in the United States, probably more so, or maybe as much, but more so than other identities that people hold, it is very, because the term racism and white supremacist holds such stigma, and they are so loaded in terms of connected to a whole history of really atrocious behaviors and systemic and interpersonal like grievances and atrocities, that any coming close to any of that is really hard for folks to deal with, especially in an interracial conversation. And I think the other piece here is that so much of this DEI work is attempting to make the invisible visible to people and adding language to things that maybe haven't had a term on them before. So for example, I'm a Black woman in America. You could probably ask many people of color in the United States, and they could probably come up with multiple instances of where they've felt a microaggression of some sort. And I would guess, Dennis, that that's probably one of the words that is controversial in a lot of settings, right? And some folks would say that that's not a real thing. But I can tell you from personal experience that microaggressions are a very real thing where it can be it's a very small interaction that seems relatively innocent, not intended to harm, but the impact of it on the person on the receiving end of it can be really hurtful. And the accumulative effect of many microaggressions in lots of different contexts is a message about your value and who you are and where you belong and what freedom you have or don't have in your country or in your community. And so I think in talking about things like privilege and fragility, I remember reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, and reading through it and thinking to myself, oh my goodness, someone wrote down all the things that I've noticed before, that I've experienced before, that I have seen before. And to know that that concept in that book and many other similar things that have been written by others like Ibram Kendi, et cetera, have been seen as like really controversial. I'm like, oh, but this is like the reality. This is how it actually feels to be a person of color in a world that wasn't necessarily designed for you or by you. These are some of the things that you encounter on a daily basis. How could this be controversial? And I think in the process of moving, looking at American history and kind of moving from, slavery to Jim Crow to, civil rights and all of these big moments in history, there's an assumption that we are post-racial, that we're actually done. Everyone's equal. If you just work hard, you can make it, that no one's being judged by the color of their skin. Like we all agree that Martin Luther King was right. We've got all the laws. This is why we don't need affirmative action anymore. This is why we don't need all these other protections, because we're done. Racism is over. We solved it. We've moved on. And I think that if you're a person of color in the United States, you pretty much can agree that that's not fully done. We can see this in institutions. We can see this in policy. We can see this in interpersonal relationships. I mean, we can see it even in education, right? And the outcomes that we see that are still, when you disaggregate by race, you can still see African-American students, the lowest performing group amongst all groups. And so that's just an example of how it tells me that we're not done with our work. So.
And Channa, let me just offer a thought myself, then I'll come back to you, Dennis. I had a discussion a few months ago with someone in my community who's been on a school board for a number of years locally in my very purple county in California. She's a conservative person, and we got to talking about Black Lives Matter, and then we had a more extensive, really productive conversation about whether pride belongs in schools. And I sort of took the position that these efforts to call out particular groups that have been harmed, LGBTQ community is a group of people that have not felt pride for a bunch of reasons, that we're calling attention to that. Black Lives Matter, and of course, all lives matter, which is what she said, but we're calling attention to a group that hasn't mattered as much as they should have. And her reaction was, well, first of all, I don't like being put into the category as a white person as an oppressor. Said, I am not an oppressor. And what she wasn't appreciating, in my view, was we're not talking about her individually. We're talking about a group historically that you could connect more oppression to one group than another. But she didn't like the idea that her kids might be going to school, that there would be white kids being made to feel guilty or shame simply because of their race, or that she is necessarily, and white people in this community are necessarily more privileged than others. And so I think both of you alluded to that, and that probably isn't a very fruitful direction to go, that it can be off-putting. But she just didn't think that when it came to pride, we ought to be calling out the bullying that goes on with one group. She goes, there are a lot of white kids that get bullied, and of course I said, nobody deserves to be bullied. We ought to pay attention to it anytime it happens. But when we call out a group, Black Lives Matter or Pride, it's about calling attention to groups that have been subjects of oppression and discrimination and bigotry far more than others. But was trying to understand where she was coming from, which is that those ways of cutting up the world and putting you into this group or that group don't really work very well for her, because it's just there's no nuance there. That doesn't acknowledge that some white people are not privileged, many white people are not oppressors, and she doesn't like the implication that that she is. Dennis, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this.
I'd love to share them. Can I ask you just to clarify one thing about that your friend? Do you know what it is? What was it about? What was it that was making her feel like people thought she was an oppressor?
Because the language, and she's, some of the DEI training has people separate into groups of oppressors, or at least she's heard about it. I don't know if she's literally seen it, but there is language that's used among educators of being, if you're white, you're privileged. If you're not white, you're not. If you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're not white, you're oppressed. You're a victim. And then what we have to do is rectify that. And it does feel, I think to some, I'm not sure her, that in order to rectify those inequities, we have to take from one group and give to another. And that's another thing she said she objected to.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. I assume that's what it was. And so there's the point about how I think language is one of those things that certain things are thrown around. When you call people oppressors, or when you tell them that they're responsible for historic inequities now, you're going to, as Channa articulated earlier, you're going to put them in a position of being defensive at that point. And so so I think that's certainly something that I think that I know I've seen in certain workshops. Now, like Channa and yourself, this is an interest of mine. It's part of my career, so I probably pay more attention to it than the average layperson does. But you do see, just phenomenal training, and then you see some things that are just awful. And in the way that Channa said earlier, that there are bad players out there. There are obviously bad players out there who are racist and who will push back on things because they're racist. I think that's a small group. I also think that there are bad players out there who, their financial well-being is enhanced by people going after each other on these particular issues. It'll sell more books, it'll sell more curriculum, it'll sell more podcasts, all those pieces. So I think that you have bad players, but I think they're small, but they have much outsized impact on the conversation. And I think one of the things that Channa said earlier, I totally resonate with. I will put a different spin on it, though, when we talk about, that there are some people who think that we're done, that that racism doesn't exist anymore, that we're in 2024, and why are we even talking about this? This is that I do think that there are some folks who feel that way, and I think that there needs to obviously be some education around that. At the same time, again, because we're more interested in it than most people, so we probably read more. I've been in workshops where people have said, the United States has made zero progress since slavery and Jim Crow, that we are basically the same country as we were back then. And that's what I talk about, that there are bad players and bad ideas on both sides. The people who say there's no such thing as racism in the United States in 2024 are, and on the other side, people say, the country is just as racist as it was when slavery ended in the country. And it's one of those things where, small but outsized voices on both sides that I think contribute to all the challenges that we're talking about.
In a moment, I want to have us turn to a question of, is there a way out of this? Is there a way to embrace what is truly good and important about DEI in a way that all or most people could embrace? But before that, I just want to give you a chance, Channa, to respond to what I said and what Dennis just said.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Thinking about the conversation that you had with your friend, and it's hard to argue with her feeling that she's being called an oppressor, that that's how it feels in those conversations, and that's probably what she's hearing from constituents or other folks in the community about that's how it feels. I don't have that experience. I can imagine that it might feel that way. And I think to your point, Dennis, there's probably my first thought was that's probably really bad training. If you've got a group of people as the oppressors and another group as the oppressed, like it's like stop, that's all bad. Don't start that way. So that was my first reaction. I think the on the other hand, though, when I think about how to do this work, with young people, with students. And, I'm thinking back to some of my classrooms and, books that I've taught as an English teacher or in working with educators as a principal. I, I, I think there's a world where we as educators can do a bang up job. And I know a lot of educators are already doing such excellent work in this regard. But how we communicate that with our parents and community members about how this looks and feels, where there's something to be said about when you're sitting down and looking at the accurate history of, let's talk about race in the United States. We had an entire system for hundreds of years based on race, purely. Where that was all codified in law about how much freedom you have or not, what you're allowed to do or not, what you can, who you can marry or not, whether you get educated or not, whether you can buy a home or not. So this idea that there was a group of people, namely our government, our institutions, that specifically prevented Black people and descendants of slaves in the United States, that prevented them from having as much freedom based on the color of their skin. That is a reality. That's not up for debate. That's not an opinion. But what we do with that information right now, where none of us, well, I wasn't, I didn't live through Jim Crow. I didn't live through the civil rights movement, right? And certainly students that are in our schools right now didn't. But how do we help them come to terms with the reality of like, wow, people who look like me 100 years ago would have done very different things to people who look like you 100 years ago, right? How do you grapple with that reality, and how do we help children work through learning that history in a space that's safe, in a space that doesn't lead anyone to feel blamed, but also acknowledges the very real truth of the matter. And I think that's something we haven't, as an education system, kind of writ large, haven't figured out. And we certainly haven't figured it out necessarily in our broader society. I think there's pockets of places where this works really well, where people have sorted out how to have these sorts of difficult and courageous, I'll say, conversations. But I don't think it's something that we figured out how to do kind of across the board. And it's certainly not something that can happen just in school. It's got to be a collaboration with families and community members and teachers, because if parents are feeling like, I don't want my child having that conversation in school, and they block it or prevent it, it throws up all sorts of barriers. I think what it feels like for, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I think what ends up feeling like when conversations about equity or about race in our country in schools end up getting blocked, when I hear about books being banned or certain pieces of history being omitted or being characterized as, calling the slave trade, the triangle trade, as purely an economic decision without acknowledging the human impact of that work, for example. As a Black person, that feels really hurtful. It feels like I'm being gaslit by the whole country. It doesn't feel, it's like it kind of invalidates the experience of knowing that your ancestors experienced something in this country without it being explained in a really true way. I think one other piece that comes up for me is understanding that nobody is one thing, right? So we all are, living in very intersectional lives. We are not just, no one is just a white person, and white is not code for rich, and white is not code for educated, right? There are lots of different disenfranchised white people of color who are living in all different sorts of different strata, and are privileged in some domains and disadvantaged in others. And so I think that's also maybe where our equity and DEI conversations go wrong, is we attempt to bucket people in really fixed ways that's in an inaccuracy. And I think that also then undermines the conversation and kind of impedes progress moving forward.
So I wonder, how do we have conversations about DEI that doesn't put people into buckets? It doesn't stereotype people and make assumptions that cause some people to feel resentment about being characterized in ways that don't really reflect who they specifically are, who their children are. Dennis, what's the way out of this? How do we embrace a concept of DEI, whatever term we want to use, that people across the political aisle would probably embrace? Save for those who are at the margins that aren't really committed to these ideals anyway. But we're talking, I think we agree that's probably a really small portion of the people that live in this country.
I think the key to what you just asked, I think Channa hit it in her response. I think that there is that piece of complexifying people's identity. That people are more than one thing; they're more than two things. And so when you are when you're having conversations about historical injustices and even the impact of historical injustices on the world, on this country, on other countries, everywhere. I think it's possible to have those conversations without stereotyping or boiling somebody's identity down to one thing, because that puts you on either that victim or the oppressor side, and that becomes even inadvertently, if it's just done through a poor training, that becomes the identity of people who are in that workshop, or identity of people who are in that curriculum. And so the idea of understanding that you're not one thing, you're not two things, you're probably a dozen things, easy. And so complexifying the identity, I think, is a big step. And then I think the other thing is, and again, I'll have to quote a friend of mine who uses this as a way of clarifying things. We have to embrace the conversation. It's not that we have not been taught to have these conversations. It's that we've been taught not to have these conversations. And so that whole idea of, and I don't mean like there's a formal training about don't have these conversations. I mean, it feels like the third rail. Let's not talk about that. Let's just move on from that piece. So we've kind of been taught not to embrace these conversations. And so I think that there is a piece of, creating that, I don't want to use another one of those terms that can sometimes set people off, but creating a safe space for everybody to feel like, I'm going to come here. And I'm going to be affirmed in my identity. I'm going to be, who I am as a person. I'm going to be affirmed in that identity, and no one's going to take pot shots at me for just being who I am today. And once I am affirmed in that identity, then I can be challenged to see things from somebody else's perspective. But if we do those two things out of order, or we don't affirm who you are, and then we challenge you to think differently, then the walls go up. And so you start off by seeing people for who they are, and for all the many good, bad, and indifferent things about them, and then you move forward in the conversation.
No, I want to pick up on that theme a little bit. One of the things that strikes me about schools today, and what I think contributes to the culture wars and people not talking to each other, is that schools aren't particularly good places at promoting engagement with parents in the community. It's a bit of, let us do our work, and we want you to support us, but, we know how to do this. And generally that has kind of worked. People historically have trusted teachers and schools to do their work. Now you alluded to people who profit from conflict. And Amanda Ripley and others refer to them as conflict entrepreneurs. These are people that benefit politically and financially by stirring up conflict. And what they do is they say things about what's going on, say in schools, that cause people to become fearful. Oh, they're doing that. They're grooming. Those LGBTQ teachers are grooming kids, or they're withholding information from parents. And you take people that weren't fearful, and now you tell them they're doing these things. And if you aren't there witnessing it and talking with those people, you get fearful. And it's stirred up by people that are profiting from that. I want to run an idea by both of you and see what you think, because I'm really intrigued with this idea, and I'm talking with people around the country about experimenting with this idea. But the idea is to invite educators and parents and even students of some age, middle school and up, to engage in conversations about what our core values are. What do we really believe is important, and what do we think schools ought to be accomplishing? And when I've done that locally in my community here, in conservative areas and in mixed political areas, people enjoy those conversations. They want to talk about it. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this, but sometimes I am. I'm also inspired by it. Most people agree on the same core values. They want kids to learn to think. They want them to be well informed. They want all kids to have opportunities to learn. They want a rich, varied curriculum. They want to see arts in the curriculum. And so if we start there and start having these conversations and do the opposite of what you said, Dennis, which is people learning not to talk about these things, but you invite people in and say, look, we're going to set up these guardrails. We're going to agree to a few conversation agreements that we're going to listen to each other and be curious. But once people start to get to know each other, and it's harder to dehumanize those teachers out there for doing something that you've heard they're doing that may in fact not be the case. And I just wonder if promoting more engagement around those constituencies, parents and students and educators, is a way out of this, because then people are not making assumptions. They're defining their terms. They're doing it in a safe environment. And out of that might come a mission statement that may be very similar to what we already had, or maybe new language, but it's language that all those people can generally embrace. Channa, what do you think about that approach?
I love it. I mean, I think that's really the only thing that will present us with any big measure of progress. I think when I think about our schools today, they are very segregated, racially, socioeconomically, in terms of opportunity and, parents' education level. We are still living in neighborhoods and going to schools in neighborhoods that are not very mixed. There's pockets of it. Sure, there's lots of neighborhoods that are racially and socioeconomically diverse, but then there are a lot of neighborhoods where it's very homogeneous, where most people look and sound the same and have the same ideas and have the same background. I think that's the benefit and the drawback of neighborhood schools. This is a remnant in many ways of, the history of housing in our country. And I won't go into that, but I think that we see that show up in schools in a lot of different ways. But I do know that when there's proximity to people who are different from you, and to your point, where we can, find those common core values, there's actually more in common, I think, than we have that divides us. But if you don't know anyone who's different from you, and people who look a certain way or believe a certain way or speak a certain way, you have built a narrative, or you've believed that all those groups, all those people believe a certain thing, or they're different or a threat to you in some way, or are taking something from you that you think belongs to you, or whatever it is. I think that, to me, that's a lot is based on fear. and a lack of understanding that if we were actually able to be together, I think you're going to get a lot more traction in terms of a lot of these concepts, and it will feel less prescribed and less like, I have to take this thing and become a different person, but more around meeting you where you are. There's a couple things that we're doing at our county office that I think are kind of cool, trying to get after that and kind of less, sit down, here's a training, and we're going to teach you all these vocabulary words about privilege and bias and all those things. We've definitely moved away from that and tried to find more organic ways for people to build those sense of understanding. And one of them, I mean, it sounds pretty simple, maybe a little hokey, is we have a book club that we do, and it's called the Growth Track. And we read books from different perspectives. It's mostly memoirs written by people who've lived a certain experience. We read one book about a young person who was undocumented and smuggled into this country. And reading that story gives you a whole different perspective, from a first-person perspective, about what that person was living through and escaping and hoping for when they came to America, to another book about, a blind attorney, a deaf and blind attorney in the United States who, I don't know what it's like to be either one of those things, but to read a story and be able to have conversations with my colleagues about what that must feel like, especially when some of those books are reflective of experiences that my colleagues have had. I can sit and hear and listen to them in a much different way and be a lot more receptive and understanding, and naturally, organically think about ways that I have been privileged, ways that I have been biased, ways that I have maybe been less forgiving or been afraid of different groups of people without anyone telling me to be afraid, or without anyone telling me that I was wrong. It actually comes up naturally in conversation, and you have this level of like conviction, like, oh man, I know I that way before. I've thought that way before. Like, I don't even want to admit it to anyone, right? And I think, so we're looking for ways in our DEI team to have set up and facilitate and host conversations amongst people that don't entail any of the vocabulary a lot of the times, and have people come to that understanding kind of on their own. And we've done some work with the National Equity Project over the years, and they've kind of given us this kind of framework that I really love, and and this is the idea that making change towards greater equity, greater diversity, greater inclusion and belonging requires us to do work along three levels. Alone, right? Where you do your own kind of self-reflection, your own awareness, like reading a novel or reading a memoir about something that's completely outside your experience. I'd consider that alone work, that mirror work. In affinity, so with other people that have similar experiences or perspectives as you. So this is where you might have like an affinity group for Black folks or Latino, whatever, different identities. And then across different. So once you've done those two things, then you can start to have those conversations across difference, where you can have a whole different perspective from someone else and feel secure and safe in such a way that you can have a complex, multi-layered, maybe courageous conversation that feels like it could be tense, but you're in a space with friends where there's something worth restoring and keeping together, because you do have shared values, you do have a common interest in making your organization function more effectively, or whatever the point might be.
Yeah, there's a group called Starts With Us, and they ran a project. I haven't heard the results of it. It was like a 30-day challenge for people to sort of sign up and say, how can you bridge your divides with other people in your community? And it followed the same pattern that you described. It starts the first few days, you're given some questions just to reflect personally on your own tendencies to polarize and to make assumptions of people, then to reach out to people that you know and you have an affinity with. And then later in the month, they urge you and give you something every day to reach out and connect with someone who's different, someone you wouldn't ordinarily talk to. But I have to say, Channa, one thing that you helped me realize is that I think the go-to response when there's a problem, the go-to response by educators is we need a training. But what you said so beautifully is that you helped me understand is that, that's about us in the know, telling other people about what they should know. And we're going to train you in DEI practices. And that is not the same thing as engagement and people listening and starting with your own issues and questions and tendencies. So I think what I was proposing in terms of inviting people in is not training. It's about people sitting down. Let's just talk about what's important to us and our experiences. But Dennis, let me have you weigh into on what you've been hearing.
Yeah, so many great ideas and so much good conversation. And I thank you both for it. I really so resonate what was talked about with boils down to values and really finding out what's behind people's opinions, and that unfortunately that takes time. That's not something you're going to do in an hour training. It's not something you're going to do in a day's training. That's one of those things that's done person to person or in a group of people that feels like they can go deeper, and it's a place where there's mutual respect for each other. And people don't tend to go there quickly. They kind of tentatively go and see, was that okay, and was that okay, and they move a little bit, and so much of that just happens in relationships. One of the things that I do is I do a lot of training around emotional intelligence, and one of the ways to get people to increase their empathy is to have them read first person narrative novel or memoirs, because you put yourself in the place of the person, because you're hearing their emotions through it. And so I think it's a brilliant thing to do. And I think that there's probably a space for, if you have hardened viewpoints on things like immigration, then read those memoirs of people who came to the country illegally, and read those memoirs about what that was like for them, and understand their experience. If you have strong feelings around what people from different backgrounds, if you feel like that there's a default political position for young Black kids in schools, have them read memoirs of well-known Black conservatives, and what did that mean for them growing up? How did they come to their viewpoints? Expose people to folks who are coming from a different perspective, and will challenge your beliefs, because as you mentioned, we tend to surround ourselves with people who believe what we believe, and then we create an echo chamber.
Channa, you may not know this, but Dennis he mentioned part of an organization called the Pro-Human Foundation, and I think you're listed as a partner, Dennis, in that.
An advisor.
An advisor, yeah. So there's one of the founder, maybe the founder of that organization, is a guy named Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a Black man. He's a very accomplished musician, and one of the people that became a fan of his as a white guy in South Carolina, as I recall the story, who eventually introduced himself to Mr. Davis and said, "I really love your music." They got to know each other. Turns out this white guy is a member of the Klan. And Daryl Davis doesn't reject him. In fact, he says, "We got to spend more time talking." It's a very long and a very inspiring, instructive story. But Daryl asks the question, "How is it that you could hate me without knowing me?" And he asks that eventually of hundreds of KKK members, many of whom end up giving Daryl their robes. And it was through empathy and not rejecting them, listening to them and their story, that causes people to question without feeling too much shame initially. Maybe they brought it on themselves and realizing that they didn't want to be that hateful person. So Daryl is someone that I may be interviewing for this podcast in a couple of months. I've heard indications from the pro-human people that we're going to set that up, and I'm excited about that. But it's just an example of what can happen with empathy, and even with people that we think are abhorrent is to listen to their story and to find out, to be curious and not be too contemptuous of them. But let me just give you both a chance to offer a final thought before we sign off. Channa, how about you?
I think it's unfortunate that DEI is taking such a rap, has such a bad rap in some spaces across our society. But on the other hand, I'm glad that the conversation got started. And I think that even as, I don't know this to be true about major corporations necessarily, but I do feel like in education, it's opened a door, and that, during COVID, after George Floyd was killed, it opened a door for a conversation that I don't know has been so fully open in our society in a long time. And I think it's brought to the fore a lot of work that still needs to be done across all different number of diversities that we have, not just racial, but many others. And I think I'm inspired for the work that's coming. And I also think our young people, those young people that are in school right now, our current college students, I think they have a lot of ideas about the kind of world that they want and the kind of education system that they want to see, not just for themselves, but for future generations. And I am committed to hearing from them and making sure that to the extent possible, we can shift how our public schools look and sound and feel for people so that everyone really does feel seen, heard, and valued so that they can learn. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Yeah. Thank you, Channa. Dennis, final thought?
I'm an optimist by nature, but I tell everybody I'm a paranoid optimist. I'm always worried about what's going to go wrong, but I tend to think things are gonna work out. There was a great quote by Bill Clinton years ago when he said, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by America, by the things that are nothing about that's bad about us that can't be fixed by things that are right about us. And we've all got a choice to make. We can choose to be pessimistic about things, or we can choose to be optimistic about things. And I think conversations like this, and I again just thank both of you so much for this conversation. And I think there are just a number of people out there who are approaching all of this from just great perspectives. I think Pro-Human Foundation obviously is one of them. I see organizations like the Theory of Enchantment by Chloe Valdary, an organization called Moral Courage by Irshad Manji. There are so many organizations out there that I believe are working so hard to have meaningful and deep conversations, because this whole subject of having true diversity and inclusion is so incredibly important. So I think we're in a blip right now. I agree that 2020 probably opened a door, and then like every other situation, the pendulum will swing somewhere and there'll be reaction to it, but then the pendulum will go in a good direction. And I feel like it's going to go in a good direction, and I think that there's there's a reaction that is some reaction that's warranted and some reaction that's unwarranted, but I feel like we're gonna come out of that and move in the right direction.
Well, Dennis and Channa, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. For those listening out there, you can find this episode along with links to articles referenced in our conversation and other related content at schoolconversations.org and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Bye, everyone.